the story didn't explode all at once. It crept in sideways, through clipped audio, half-heard quotes, and a tone shift that people couldn't quite place at first. Joe Rogan had talked about boxing for years. He had praised fighters, mocked mismatches, warned about danger, and celebrated courage. None of that was new. What was new was the edge in his voice when Jake Paul's name came up after the Anthony Joshua fight. Not sarcasm, not curiosity, anger, real unfiltered anger. The kind that doesn't sound rehearsed and doesn't care how it lands. At the center of it all was a simple, brutal fact that no one could argue with. Jake Paul had stepped into the ring with Anthony Joshua, and 6 rounds later, his jaw was broken in 2 places. Titanium plates. Emergency surgery. Blood on the canvas. Whatever anyone thought about celebrity boxing, whatever suspicions hovered around matchmaking or money, that punch was real. The damage was real. And once the footage circulated, once the slow-motion replays showed Joshua's right hand detonating on Paul's chin, the conversation stopped being theoretical. Before that moment, the fight itself already felt like a collision of worlds. Jake Paul, the YouTuber turned prizefighter, built on spectacle, controversy, and carefully curated opposition. Anthony Joshua, an Olympic gold medalist, a former unified heavyweight champion, a man whose entire life had been structured around boxing at the highest level. On paper, it was absurd. In reality, it was dangerous. Rogan had said as much before the fight, openly admitting that the idea of Paul taking on Joshua bordered on insanity. He described Joshua as a nuclear puncher, someone who didn't just knock people out, but shut systems down. When Rogan warned that one clean right hand could end a night, he wasn't exaggerating. He was stating physics. Fight night in Miami carried that tension from the opening bell. Paul didn't come forward to trade. He couldn't. His entire strategy revolved around survival, movement, clinching, distance, anything to avoid being stationary in front of a heavyweight who knew how to cut the ring. When Joshua closed space, Paul grabbed, dropped levels, even fell to his knees 2 seconds. It wasn't pretty, but it was human. Fear showed, not cowardice, but awareness, the kind of fear that understands consequences. What surprised people wasn't that Joshua won. It was that it took 6 rounds. That single detail cracked the door open for everything that followed. Boxing fans are conditioned to read time as meaning. First round knockout means mismatch. Long fight means resistance, or something else. When Paul made it out of the first, then the second, then the third, whispers began. When he reached the 6th, the whispers turned into accusations. Why was Joshua patient? Why wasn't he unloading? Was he pulling punches? Was this real? Then the punch landed, and all of those questions collided with reality. Joshua cornered Paul, timed him, and fired a right hand that echoed through the arena. Paul's body went limp before he hit the canvas. The referee waved it off instantly. Doctors rushed in. Cameras caught the aftermath. Blood, stillness, the unmistakable aftermath of trauma. Paul was taken straight to the hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to reconstruct his jaw. No one could fake that. No one could script titanium plates. In the immediate aftermath, the mood should have settled. It didn't. Instead, it intensified. A video from promoter Lou DeBella went viral, questioning whether Joshua had given full effort early in the fight. That single spark lit a bonfire. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just about Paul losing. It was about whether the integrity of boxing itself had been compromised. And when Joe Rogan addressed it on his podcast, the temperature changed completely. Rogan didn't hedge. He didn't dance around hypotheticals. According to those present and those who heard the recording, he went on one of the most intense rants of his broadcasting career. He talked about damage, about concussions compressed into a single punch, about the invisible cost fighters pay long after the crowd goes home. He talked about the possibility that, if accusations of manipulation or corruption were ever proven true, jail time wouldn't be excessive. It would be deserved. That statement landed like a grenade. Rogan wasn't a fringe voice. He was one of the most influential figures in combat sports media. When someone like him even entertains the idea of criminal consequences, people listen. Some agreed instantly, seeing celebrity boxing as a slow erosion of a sport built on sacrifice and legitimacy. Others pushed back, accusing Rogan of going too far, of letting emotion override evidence. But no one ignored it. What made the moment even stranger was how sharply Rogan's position contrasted with his earlier praise of Jake Paul. Before the fight, he had openly respected Paul for taking the risk. He called it one of the craziest propositions he'd ever seen. A man who had recently fought a 58-year-old Mike Tyson stepping in with one of the scariest heavyweights on the planet. Rogan acknowledged the guts it took to even sign the contract. He warned, repeatedly, about the danger. And then the danger arrived exactly as predicted. Afterward, Rogan's concern shifted from courage to consequence. He spoke about brain health, depression, addiction, the long arc of damage that doesn't show up on highlight reels. He framed the knockout not as entertainment, but as a warning. If someone's jaw breaks in two places from one punch, what's happening inside the skull is worse, much worse. In Rogan's view, continuing down that path wasn't bravery. It was gambling with something you don't get back. Meanwhile, Jake Paul's team went on the offensive. Lawsuits were threatened. Cease-and-desist letters were sent. Accusations were labeled defamatory. Nikki Saabadarian, co-founder of Most Valuable Promotions, appeared on Errol Helwani's show to shut the narrative down. He denied any suggestion of fight fixing, called the claims ridiculous, and pointed to the obvious. You don't fake a broken jaw. He explained the strategy, the movement, the survival tactics, arguing that running and clinching wasn't evidence of manipulation. It was boxing, especially when facing a larger, stronger opponent. Vidarian also addressed the expectations. Joshua himself had predicted a first-round knockout. When that didn't happen, the narrative shifted. People wanted a reason. Conspiracies filled the gap where patience and reality should have been. According to Paul's camp, the fight went longer because Paul executed a survival strategy well enough to delay the inevitable. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as defenses mounted, doubts lingered. Boxing insiders whispered about contract clauses, weight limits that seemed unusually favorable to Paul. Joshua capped at 245 pounds, lighter than his natural walking weight. Financial terms designed to level the field as much as possible. None of that proved a fix, but it blurred lines. It raised questions about where smart matchmaking ends and something more uncomfortable begins. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Jake Paul's entire boxing career had been shadowed by skepticism from the start. Early opponents were fellow YouTubers, MMA fighters with no boxing background, former athletes from other sports, aging legends well past their prime. Each fight was lucrative. Each win expanded his platform. Hardcore boxing fans watched with folded arms, unconvinced. To them, it felt curated, manufactured, entertaining, but not sacred. The Anthony Joshua fight was supposed to settle that. A real heavyweight, a real risk, a real consequence, and in some ways, it did. Paul paid the price physically, but the fact that it took 6 rounds reopened every old wound in the sport's psyche. Boxing has lived with corruption, fixes, and scandals before. It has survived them, but not without scars. When people sense patterns, even if those patterns are coincidental, the trust erodes fast. Other voices joined the conversation. Analysts warned that celebrity boxing had gone too far, that crossover fights blur accountability, that when entertainment and danger collide, someone eventually gets hurt badly. Teddy Atlas called the Tyson fight embarrassing. Others pointed to the absurdity of massive paydays compared to fighters grinding in obscurity. The optics were ugly, regardless of intent. Anthony Joshua, for his part, handled the aftermath with restraint. He credited Paul for toughness, acknowledged his persistence, and showed respect. There was no gloating, no dismissal. From Joshua's perspective, the job was done. He fought, he won, he moved on. But the noise followed anyway. As weeks passed, the controversy refused to die. Clips resurfaced. Quotes were dissected. Rogan's comments about jail time were replayed and debated endlessly. Was he speaking hypothetically? Was he overreacting? Or was he saying what many were thinking but wouldn't say out loud? The boxing world split, not just over Jake Paul, but over what boxing should be allowed to become. At the core of it all sat a single, uncomfortable truth. Boxing is dangerous even when done correctly. When shortcuts, spectacle, or blurred incentives enter the equation, the margin for error disappears. Jake Paul didn't fake that knockout, Anthony Joshua didn't fake that punch, but the ecosystem that produced the fight was fair game for scrutiny, and that's why this story refuses to settle. It isn't just about whether Paul belongs in a ring. It's about whether boxing can protect its credibility while chasing attention. It's about whether courage excuses risk and whether money dulls judgment. It's about how far the sport can bend before something breaks that can't be repaired with surgery. If you made it this far, let's hear from you. Did Joe Rogan go too far with his comments? Or did he say what needed to be said? Was the Joshua fight proof?